Okay. Hello, world. Christopher here, and I want to talk about some ideas. And I want to just mention up front that these ideas are not my ideas. Uh, they're just a link between a couple of really cool ideas. So let's get started. The Vesica Pisces and the dorsal ventral surfaces. The Vesica Pisces is an old idea, and it's been a very inspiring idea for people over the centuries. It's inspired a bunch of thinkers. It's one of the fundamental principles of sacred geometry or contemplative geometry, symbolic geometry. It's it's one of the core ideas. It's probably the core idea behind all of it. And in sacred geometry, they call it the first division. And here's what it means. So basically, you imagine yourself floating in the void of infinite black nothingness of space, and you begin to define yourself. You pick a point, you start with the point, and you define yourself out into space, and you create matter. It's a long story, but the first movement skips past 0 to 1 and describes what happens when 1 becomes 2. So 0 to 1 is basically when a point becomes a circle or a sphere. This is the difference between nothing and something. This is the definition of location when you pick a point. The problem is that it has nothing to relate to. The sphere is uniform in all directions. There's no differentiation at all. And so the first movement, the second day of Genesis, it is the definition of orientation. And this spirit or life force exists in this point. It's looking out, and it can pick anywhere to project itself, to move. And in this diagram, this representation of it, this visual representation of how life in embodied matter, we can take this and make a radius to any point in the circumference of the circle. There's an infinite number of possibilities. For convention, our world divides it up into 360, but there's an infinite number of points, right? But out of that infinite number of points, it picks one direction and goes to the outermost reaches of itself and does the same thing, projects its awareness. So it creates another circle here. And with this first day of Genesis, location is defined, orientation is defined, and the relationship of these two areas gives matter a lot of information, a ton of information. It creates this point, it creates the 60-degree circle, the hexagonal pattern. A lot is created in this moment of time. Another thing that is created is that this shape inside of here, if you made these spheres, then this shape in here, it looks kind of somewhat like a football. And there's a seam that runs down the center. It's like if you had two bubbles and they joined together, there would be a seam around where those two bubbles connected, those two membranes connected. And so this is if this is the shadow bottom area and this is the top, this is a three-dimensional Vesica Pisces. If you looked at it from the top, it would just be a straight circle. Or if you looked at it from the side of this diagram, it would just be a straight circle. But it's actually an edge. It's the definition of an edge. The geometrical concept of an edge comes about in the Vesica Pisces. And interestingly, all of this is happening and there's no definition of a point on the surface. Just an edge. An edge with a line with no points. We could talk about this for a long time. If you're really interested in a deep dive of the Vesica Pisces, I would recommend Keith Critchlow's Time Stands Still. He goes into quite an essay on it. But so does almost every book that's ever been written about sacred geometry. I mean, the Vesica Pisces here was the inspiration of medieval architects when they would put this at the top of the doorway. And it was, the Vesica Pisces for them was meant to symbolize the union of heaven and earth. Just in a nutshell, the Vesica Pisces means bladder of the fish. And bladder of the fish, what does that mean? Well, think about a fish in an ocean. And inside of this fish, there's another little microcosmic ocean. There's an organ that holds water. And so a definition of the microcosm is one idea of the Vesica Pisces. The definition of as above, so below, of a fractal iteration, of self-similar reproduction through scale. So, I mean, again, we could talk about this all day, but what I want to talk about today is what this means in relationship to the dorsal ventral surfaces, as defined by John Appleton and his work on posture release imagery. So what John is saying, the first principle of his work is of the distinction and the difference of the dorsal ventral surfaces. So he has this beautiful image, which I'll show, of an evolutionary sequence from a tiny little disc to something with a head and a tail, to something with limbs, to something that's crawling, to something that's standing and walking, to a full-on human being. And his discovery, the first principle of his work is that this first disc here has a top and a bottom. That the top is the dorsal surface and the bottom is the ventral surface. And that through the evolution to the human form, that a lot of changes happen, but that the same relationship of parts is operating. And so if we take the Vesica Pisces as the definition of orientation, apply it to this tiny little disc, this little organism, and say that this relationship is the fundamental geometry of our relationship to the planet, to the sun and the earth. The fundamental relationship to our planet, how we orient ourselves on planet Earth. I don't know how to say it any more clearly. I love John's work and how he describes this and all of the amazing ways that he has come up with for how to recalibrate your dorsal ventral relationship. It's astounding work, but that's the idea. So check it out. Thank you for your time. I will see you soon.